Hello students, this is Dr. Hank. With this lecture, we are going to be completing our discussion about conservation challenges in Amazon rainforest. With part 1, we basically introduced what is conservation biology, and we also discussed about some of the basic theory and some examples. With this, we are going to focus on threats to rainforests, and also we'll talk briefly about conservation of rainforests. Okay, so let's start with the threats. So far, we have identified 7 major threats to biodiversity. The first one is habitat destruction, fragmentation, and degradation. And collectively, we recognize these first 3 threats as habitat loss. And the global climate change is the latest, and it's actually interfering with everything. Overexploitation, invasive species, and diseases are some other major threats to biodiversity. And if you think about any protected species, and they are threatened at least because of 2 or more of these threats. And also, these threats are actually working together to create a synergistic effect. So basically, the effect is greater than the individual effect. And you can actually understand that interaction with this image. So in the green box up here, it shows the human activities that may actually impact the biodiversity, such as agriculture, logging, fisheries, urbanization. Uh, and then, as a result of these human activities, uh, we create some major threats to biodiversity, such as habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. And overexploitation is another direct result of human activities, such as fisheries. And also, mainly because of movement of various things around the globe, we are introducing invasive species in daily basis. And also, you can see that some of these threats are interacting with each other to create a synergistic effect. For an example, let's say in a recently logged habitat, now we have a clear area, and we've just created a new niche for some invading species. So these new invading species can colonize that open land, and it's a net loss of native biodiversity, but at the same time we gain some new invasive species, which is going to be creating more and more problems down the road. And also think about overexploitation. So think about a fragmented landscape. So compared to the previous unfragmented continuous landscape, now the poachers can easily invade a fragmented landscape and poach animals easily. And climate change, again, it's interacting with everything. The final outcome would be the loss of biodiversity. So some populations are going to extinction, some are actually crashing, and some ecosystems are completely degraded. Uh, so overall net effect would be the loss of global biodiversity. Okay, so let's start with the US situation. This paper by Wilco and colleagues analyze the threats to imperiled species in the United States. So these are all listed species in Endangered Species Act. And you will be actually reading a paper on this issue, the very same paper for the class. But let me summarize. So this graph summarizes the degree of threat. The x-axis is the threat category from habitat destruction to diseases, and the y-axis is percentage species affected. As you can see, habitat loss is the number 1 cause overall, and the second one is the invasive species, followed by pollution, overexploitation, and diseases. So what's going on in the global scale? So this graph summarizes 6 threats across 4 different taxa: amphibians, birds, mammals, and gymnosperms. These are flowering plants. And the y-axis is percent of threatened species affected by this particular threat. Do you see any significant patterns? Take a moment to look at these green bars. So one is very obvious, right? Look at this. Habitat loss and degradation. Across all the taxa, 80% of organisms are threatened due to habitat loss and degradation. In some other cases, look at the mammals and birds. Overexploitation is a significant cause, because if you think about most of the species that we are utilizing, those are either mammals or birds, and we don't have any data for fish, but I would expect a large bar for fish too. Okay, so what about amphibians? And you can see that pollution is one of the major issues with amphibians. Do you guys know why? Amphibians have to utilize both terrestrial and aquatic habitats to complete their life cycle. At the same time, they have a wet skin, so they breathe through their skin, so they are exposed to both terrestrial pollutants and aquatic pollutants. And on top of that, they lay eggs without any protective shells, so they are very vulnerable for these pollutants. So the take-home message is most of the species are threatened due to more than one threat, and the number one cause for biodiversity loss in the regional scale and also in the global scale is the habitat loss. So let's talk a little bit more about habitat loss. And there's three forms of habitat loss: habitat destruction, habitat degradation or pollution, and habitat fragmentation. And we are going to be talking about these in a second. And if you think about most species, they cannot tolerate these changes, and there's no enough time to adapt to the new environmental conditions, because evolution is a relatively slow process, but we are converting, or we are destroying habitats in a faster rate. So these animals either have to migrate to a different area, or they don't have any other options, they'll die. So the outcomes would be migration or extinction. Some mobile animals can actually migrate, but in many cases they are stranded, like in this picture. So this is a picture of a cleared rainforest in Indonesia. So they cleared actually this rainforest to start a new palm oil plantation, and this is the habitat of orangutans, and this one is stranded. It's a very sad situation. So let's focus a little bit more on rainforests, because that's our main theme, right? And we know that globally we have a very limited amount of rainforests. At the same time, they are vital for all the people on the planet Earth, because they are producing about 40% of all the oxygen, and we cannot live without oxygen. And these 7% of land mass actually harbors more than 50% of all the species on planet Earth. But at the same time, we are losing them in a very alarming rate. If we continue with the current rate, we may not have any rainforests by 2050. If you look at this map, you can see that the red areas are cleared tropical rainforests. So we've lost most of the tropical rainforest in Asia and Southeast Asia, some parts of Brazil and Madagascar, and some parts of Africa. But the good news is we still have a significant amount of tropical rainforest, mainly in South America. This is the mighty Amazon, and this is the Congo Basin, and we have some large tracts of rainforest in Papua New Guinea and Malaysia. And this is what is happening in Amazon. This left figure shows the original extent of rainforest in Brazil, and the right is the present situation, and you can see they've lost almost all the rainforests in the eastern slopes of Brazil. And the same thing is happening in Amazon, and Amazon is actually shrinking. So it's very sad, but I mean, we still have some hope. So that's why we need to learn about these rainforests and their threats, so we can actually do, we can take informed decisions when we are actually in right positions to make decisions. So major threats for rainforest destruction. Typically people think that logging is the major threat, but it's not the main one. It's the shifting cultivation. 60% of rainforest is destroyed mainly because of shifting cultivation. So shifting cultivation is a traditional way of agriculture in many developing countries. So basically the farmers clear cut a small parcel of land and then they burn it and then they cultivate things. So after several years, after the decline of the fertilizing the fertility of land, they actually move to a different slot, do the same thing, and eventually the previous slot will be colonized. And when there's few people doing this, the impact is minimum. But when thousands or even millions of people are doing this at the same time, it can cause a huge impact. So 60% of all the rainforest destruction is due to shifting cultivation. And the second one is commercial logging, about 20%, and cattle ranching 10%, and all the other causes are accounting for 10% of rainforest destruction. And this is a nice example from Brazil again. Rondônia is one of the states in Brazil. So you can see in 1985 they created this new road, and after the road, and you can see that there's more roads parallel to each other. These are logging roads. By 2001, in 15 years, most of the image is pink. So less green, more pink. They basically converted most of the landscape into logging operations, shifting cultivations, and things like that. And this is happening all over the Amazon, mainly in the edges of the Amazon. And one of the major developments which actually contributed to rainforest destruction is Trans-Amazonia Highway. This highway actually connects the eastern Brazil to Peru. So you can actually drive from Atlantic to Pacific. And this highway is actually constructed through the rainforest, and in this picture you can see it basically divided the rainforest into fragments. So habitat fragmentation is another form of habitat loss. So basically we define habitat fragmentation as reduction of large continuous areas of natural habitat into two or more parcels or fragments. And a road could do this, a new town or a dam across a river. So these are all ways that we actually fragment habitats. And the fragmentation is actually bad because some wildlife need large tracts to complete their life cycles, complete their natural life histories. For an example, large carnivores and frugivores. Frugivores are fruit-eating animals like orangutans. They need large tracts of habitat to sustain themselves. Once fragmented, they really cannot actually support their original population sizes, so their populations will crash. This is a nice example from England, and you can see how the fragmentation actually progressed over about 200 years, or more than 200 years actually. So what are the differences between original and fragmented habitats? So fragments have greater edge and greater exposure to edge effect, and we'll talk more about edge effect in a second. So think about the the ratio between area and the perimeter. So once you are actually getting smaller and smaller fragments, you have a relatively large perimeter compared to the area, and that's not good, and you'll learn why when we are talking about edge effect. And also the center of the fragment is closer to an edge, and basically this tells that things like invasive species or poachers can easily access the interior of the habitat because of this less distance. And also, as a result of fragmentation, former larger populations divided into smaller populations, and it's pretty obvious. So what are the impacts of fragmentation? So essentially the fragmentation creates barriers between natural habitats. So it can actually reduce normal movement of organisms or their developmental stages. So the dispersal and colonization will be affected. And dams can fragment rivers and completely cut down spawning migrations of species. And also, if you think about plants, some barriers can actually reduce the seed dispersal of plants. And another direct impact of fragmentation is restricted access to food and mates, and this is very true regarding large social primates and also large carnivores. And something that we are very familiar with is roadkills. So roads actually fragment habitats, natural habitats, and roadkills are a direct result of fragmentation. And also fragmentation actually divide once large populations into small populations. And you may remember some information about metapopulations. So basically, if you think about a large area and a single species, they have small populations, but these small populations are interconnected with each other through migration and functionally act as a large population. That is a metapopulation. And once you put some barriers between these populations, it will impact the migration and it can destroy the metapopulation dynamics completely, especially with like small organisms like these tree frogs. Okay, so what is the edge effect? So edge effect is the altered environmental conditions in the edges of fragmented habitat, and it could be a physicochemical parameter or another ecological or biological parameter. And in this picture you can see an experimental fragmentation project. So once people were logging Panama, they actually did some experimental fragments, so they can actually study the impact of fragmentation. And look at this edge. So this is the natural habitat and this is the edge. This edge is strikingly different from the interior habitat, and let's see how. And they did some studies in Amazon to learn about the impacts of fragmentation. And in this graph you can actually see various parameters of edge effect and the edge penetration distance. For an example, they have observed the impact of fungal fruiting bodies is very less compared to the wind damages. So there's no significant difference between the density of fungal fruiting bodies inside the core habitat and the edge. But if you think about the wind damage, it can actually create some significant impacts. So if you read these in between effects, you can see that the light will be altered, the humidity will be altered, temperature, soil moisture, and also biological parameters such as animal abundance and the invasion probabilities of invasive species. Everything will be changed in this edge habitat compared to the interior habitat. Another form of habitat loss is pollution or habitat degradation. In some cases, the damage is not immediately apparent, such as trampling and off-road vehicles. And in this picture, you can see a herd of cattle in a cleared rainforest land. And they can essentially make bare land because of heavy grazing. And some common or very familiar forms of pollution is pesticides, sewage, fertilizers, and also oil. And we've been talking about oil spills. In this picture, it actually shows an oil spill, and they are trying to actually uh, reduce the spread of the crude oil. But as you may learn, even like slight concentrations of spilled oil can cause serious developmental issues. Can you think of what is happening here? This is in the middle of Amazon. They are mining for gold. So gold mining is happening all over the Amazon, and it can actually create some significant impacts, especially on aquatic habitats. And in this particular study, they focused on studying the impacts of small-scale gold mining on fish communities. So in this map, the red dots are disturbed sites, mainly because of gold mining, and this blue dot is our reference site, which is undisturbed. And we are going to be actually comparing various biological characteristics between these disturbed sites and undisturbed sites. The first one is the turbidity. So turbidity is the amount of suspended solids in water. So when the turbidity is high, the water looks muddy. When the turbidity is low, the water is clear. And in this graph, there's two y-axis. This one is turbidity, and this one is the water level. So basically, these bars represents the water level, and these two lines represents the turbidity, and the continuous filled circles are mining sites, and this is reference sites, the open circles. And you can clearly see that the turbidity in the mining sites are way higher than the reference sites. And this graph actually compares the fish species richness between disturbed and undisturbed sites. Y-axis is the number of fish, and you can clearly see that there's less fish species in the disturbed site. And also, if you think about the overall species diversity of fish, the diversity is pretty low in the disturbed site compared to the undisturbed site. So you can clearly see the negative impacts of gold mining on these fish communities in the Amazon rivers. Another aspect of habitat degradation is pesticide pollution. As pointed out by Rachel Carson with her book Silent Spring, DDT can actually cause some serious issues with birds through biomagnification. So biomagnification is increase of the concentrations of pesticides such as DDT through the food chain. And as a result of biomagnification, you can find the highest concentrations of these pollutants in top carnivores such as birds of prey. And this is one example, bald eagle, our national symbol. And bald eagles almost crashed in 1960s because of DDT. And this graph actually shows how the biomagnification is happening. Let's start from the very bottom, phytoplankton. They have very low concentrations of DDT in their bodies, but the next level, the consumers, they consume hundreds, maybe thousands of these. So they'll get more and more DDT. In zooplankton, they have an elevated level of DDT compared to the phytoplankton level. And as you can see, once you are ascending in the food chain, the concentration will increase, and finally there's very lethal concentrations in top carnivores and piscivorous fish. So what is the impact of these pesticides on raptors? So there's a direct link between the thickness of the egg shells and the DDT content in eggshells. So eggshell thinning was one of the major issues with raptors. So although they lay eggs, they were not successful. And abdominal development of embryos is another issue. So although they hatched, they did not develop, or they did not reach the adulthood. And in some cases, these pesticides interfered with neurotransmitters and changed the adult behavior, risking their lives. And also in some cases, high concentrations cause direct mortality. So as a result, many raptors in the United States experienced a dramatic decline in 1960s. Here is an example. So in this graph, you can see the time in the x-axis, and the dry weight, the concentration of DDT in these bars, and this is the population size. It's actually an index of the population size, number of young per breeding area. So before the DDT ban in 1973, the average DDT amount in egg shells is pretty high compared to after banning, and you can see there's a rapid decline of bald eagle population, and you can see a direct correlation between DDT concentration and the population decline of bald eagles. And then they banned DDT, and now you can see less concentrations of DDT in eggs, and the population is recovering. And this study was conducted by Dr. James Greer, and I actually took classes from Dr. Greer when I was at North Dakota State University when I was doing my PhD. Okay, what is going on here? Any clues? It's a little hill of something, and if you focus on the man on top of the hill, maybe you can come up with your answer. These are all bison skulls. So once there were millions of bison in Great Plains, and European settlers actually killed almost all of them, and this is just skulls. So overexploitation is another serious issue with the global biodiversity. Let's start with whales. So whaling is a traditional custom in many countries. However, with the Industrial Revolution, they came up with some sophisticated whaling ships, factory ships, and some sophisticated weapons to kill whales, and the frequency of harvest increased dramatically. And basically they are exploiting whales for whalebone, spermaceti, I can't even say that, spermaceti oil, and also they extract oil from whale blubber. In some countries they actually consume whale meat too. And this is what happened to whale populations. They started with the largest, like blue whales and fin whales, because you can get the most out of these large whales compared to the effort. And they overfished, or they overwhaled, and the large whale populations crashed, as you can see in this figure. And then they actually started utilizing smaller whales, because they didn't want to spend more time searching for large whales. So what they did was they tried to maximize their profits by harvesting more of these relatively small whales, and their populations crashed too. So this is a story of unsustainable harvesting, and as a result the commercial whaling actually banned in 1986. However, some nations are still doing whaling with a label of scientific work, but they are actually harvesting it for profit. And local harvesting is another new issue. I mean, people has been harvesting local populations for millennia, and they had their own local rules to keep it under sustainable limits. But nowadays, the issue is the global population is increasing dramatically, and there's many poor nations, and the easiest way to supply their protein requirements is the bushmeat. So they start with large mammals like primates, and once they have depleted large animals, they basically start harvesting everything. So in this picture you can see a harvested a chimpanzee, and this is a bushmeat market uh, in South America with a bunch of capuchin monkeys. Another new trend is international wildlife trade. uh, some species have significantly declined mainly because of wildlife trade, such as some large cats. And also in some countries, rich people like to have private collections, so people harvest things from tropics and uh, export them, like marine mollusks, orchids, butterflies. And pet trade is another big one, especially for birds. And you can see there's a bunch of uh, Amazon parakeets ready to ship in this cage. And also reef fishes is another significant one when it comes to pet trade. And also in some countries they use parts or whole animals for traditional medicine. As a response to these illegal and legal wildlife trade, they actually erected the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES, to regulate these. So we do have regulations, but the question is, are they really enforcing this? And this table summarizes the major targeted groups of wildlife from primates. We are mainly using primates for biomedical research, unfortunately, and zoos and aspects. Birds mainly for zoos. And think about the numbers traded each year: 2 to 5 million birds. Ornamental fish, that's 500 to 600 million every year, and most of these fish are harvested directly from their natural habitat, and their survival rates at the final destination is less than 1%. So if you want to supply 10 fish to your customer in US, you have to harvest at least 1,000 individuals from their natural habitat in Sri Lanka. So these are like real numbers for some species. Climate change, that's the latest, and something which is going to impact, actually which is impacting all of us right now. So let's learn a little bit more about climate change. So what are the observations? So these three graphs actually summarizes the observation. Uh, the y-axis indicates snow cover for the lower panel, and the second one is the global average sea level, third one is the global average surface temperature, and the x-axis is the timeline. If you focus on this first one, global average surface temperature, you can clearly see that it's rising after about 1950. Sea level is again rising steadily, but snow cover is declining. So what is happening? Our globe is warming up. So we can clearly see it here, and it melts most of the snow caps, and also it expands thermally at the oceans. So the ocean level is rising. And here are some examples. This is the Boulder Glacier in Glacier National Park. This is a picture taken in 1932, and you can get a feeling for the scale if you focus on these people right here. And this is 1932, and it's completely gone by 1988. It's gone. It's the same location. And this is Uppsala Glacier in Patagonia, and now we have a huge lake uh, replacing the glacier. So basically these ice caps are melting because of the increasing temperatures. And this slide summarizes all physicochemical and biological indicators of a warming world. So humidity is increasing, temperature over ocean are increasing, temperature all over is actually increasing. Sea level is rising mainly because of two reasons: melting ice and thermal expansion of oceans. Sea ice content and ice sheets are decreasing. Ocean heat content is increasing. What about biological responses? Tree lines are shifting poleward and upward because tree line basically mark uh, the favorable limits for trees. The cold areas cannot support trees, so there's a tree line. Now the tree line is actually moving up because the globe is warming up. At the same time, spring is coming early. As a result of that, there's like a whole suite of biological responses. Species are migrating poleward and upward, and let's discuss a few more of these examples. Okay, so what is the root cause of global warming? And we have identified its carbon dioxide. So atmospheric carbon dioxide levels had increased 40% from pre-industrialized levels, and this bottom panel actually shows the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, and you can see it's increasing rapidly since late 1800s. And at the same time, this upper panel shows all the human carbon dioxide emissions. And do you see the nice correlation? So who's driving the global climate change? So okay, so we identified that carbon dioxide is the main cause, but what is the mechanism? So the mechanism is the greenhouse effect. So basically we know that we are receiving a lot of energy and heat from the sun through solar radiation, and some of that heat is re-radiated from the surface of the earth, but there's a layer of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and ammonia, and that layer acts as a reflector and trap some of that heat, so we can maintain the temperature of the planet in a favorable range to support life. But the situation has changed. Once you have more carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, it traps more and more heat, and it's the reason for the heating up of our globe, and we call this greenhouse effect. So please remember that greenhouse effect is a natural phenomenon, and the issue is the elevated levels of carbon dioxide. More carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases will trap more heat, and that heats up the entire globe. Okay, so let's try to build the human connection. So we have identified that greenhouse gases are the main cause, and we haven't actually identified any large scale natural sources of greenhouse gases. At the same time, we know that atmospheric carbon dioxide levels has increased by 40% compared to the pre-industrialized levels, and we know that we emitted that 40%. The issue is not the warming, the issue is the rate of warming. It's warming up so rapidly, it's really hard to adapt to these new environmental conditions. And the most compelling recent evidence is coming from dynamic modeling. So let's focus more on the dynamic modeling. So climate scientists are using existing information and computer simulation models to predict the future scenarios or to reconstruct some of the climate scenarios. So when you are reconstructing the temperature of the globe, you can actually use both natural and anthropogenic forcings. Natural forcings are natural sources of greenhouse gases like volcanic eruptions, natural forest fires, natural methane releases, things like that. Anthropogenic forcings are things like fossil fuel burning, deforestation, man-made forest fires, things like that. So what they did was they tried to actually simulate the global temperature using just natural forcings and also by combining both natural and anthropogenic forcings, and then they tried to actually fit the actual readings with those simulations. So let's focus on this graph, the global temperature anomaly. Y-axis is the timeline. The blue bar is the models using only natural forcings, and the pink bar is models using both natural and anthropogenic forcings, and this black line is the actual reading. So it basically tells us we really cannot explain the actual readings without incorporating anthropogenic forcings. In other words, look at this jump. This increase temperatures are mainly because of natural forcings. Not natural, I'm sorry, anthropogenic forcings. And it's true for global overall values, global land values, and global ocean values. So the take-home message is global warming is man-made. And at the same time, we are predicting the future scenarios for various climatological phenomena. In this case, they have predicted the sea level change in 1990. So this red line is the actual tide gauge values. In 1990, they predicted that it could be in this range. So this is the upper end, this is the low end, and you may know that when we are predicting something future, we have to give some wiggle room, we have to add some error. So that's why as when we are moving way away from the future point, the error is increasing, right? But once you fit the actual readings, satellite observations, and we can clearly see that the actual readings are in the upper end. So that's not good. And this situation is even worse. So this is the Arctic sea ice extent, and this steady line is the average, and these blue areas are the error. So the blue is the predicted and this red is the actual. So it's happening faster than the predicted rate. That's frightening. Okay, so now let's focus on the biological responses to climate change. So if you think about biological systems, organisms, when your environment is changing rapidly, you have only three options. So first one, you can adapt to the new environmental condition, right? Or you can move away, tracking suitable climate. Otherwise, you have to just die. And if you think about most species, they can't move. Think about trees. They cannot. They are stuck. And adaptation, it takes time. So as a result of climate change, we are losing many species. So let me summarize the main impacts or responses of biological systems to climate change. The first one is species range shifts. Some species are actually moving away to track the suitable climate. And phenological shifts. Phenology is the biological timing. Spring is coming early, so the migrating birds are migrating early, things like that. And in very few cases, we have evidence for rapid evolution, tracking the suitable climate. So that's the adaptation part, right? But there's only few examples. And we also have evidence for species extinctions as a result of climate change. And finally, in some cases, the changing climate is actually favoring some disease-causing agents, hence completely altering disease dynamics. Let's start with range shifts. So recently, Parmesan and Yohi did a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is analysis of many published work and trying to come up with major information, major themes. So what they did was they analyzed lots of information gathered from past 2240 years from various ecosystems and to cover a wide variety of taxa. And this is what they have found. Overall, species are moving 6.1 kilometers per decade northward. So that makes sense, right? So northern areas are cooler than the tropical areas. And also they are moving 6.1 meters per decade upward. And also you know that as you climb a mountain, it will get cooler. And also if you think about the phenological changes or biological timing changes, things are happening 2.3 days earlier than previous. So this is an example. So Hitch and Lieberg, they studied the range shifts of eastern birds, and they actually collected data for 56 species of eastern birds using breeding bird survey data covering 26 years. On average, one of those species shifted north 2.35 kilometers per year. And in some extreme cases like Inca dove, so Inca dove is strictly a southern species, as you can see in this map. But on average, they shifted 254 kilometers north. And another one, great-tailed grackle, again this one is mainly a midwestern and southern species, and they shifted 334 kilometers northward. And when I was actually in North Dakota, right here, we actually have seen several great-tailed grackles in every spring and fall. So birds are moving north. And these impacts are severe with systems and organisms in polar regions. So for an example, species which are dependent on the sea ice have been declining, such as polar bears and emperor penguins. And also Arctic fox is declining mainly because the red fox is expanding their range into Arctic fox's range because of the warming climate. Phenology. Phenology is the timing of biological events such as blooming of a tree or spring migration of a bird, and typically these phenological events are triggered by either temperature, photoperiod, and in some cases physiological mechanisms governed by hormones. But with a warming climate, the spring is actually coming early, and also the fall is setting late. And we have very clear evidence for an advancement of spring phenology from all over the world. Okay, so in this graph I'm trying to summarize some of those advancing phenological events. So in northeastern USA, lilacs are actually flowering 3.4 days earlier, and also they are unfolding their leaves 2.6 days earlier. In United Kingdom, butterflies are appearing 2 to 3 days earlier. In Massachusetts, 16 species of migrating birds are arriving 2 to 10 days earlier, depending on the species. So you can clearly see that things are happening early because of the early arrival of the spring. Do you recognize this species? Yeah, it's a frog. Actually, it's a toad. This is golden toad. Golden toad is the first species extinct due to climate change. Once it actually lived in Costa Rica, and they always had small populations, and they were restricted to cloud forests. However, after 1989, there's no any records of this beautiful toad from Costa Rica, and basically they found that changing humidity regimes has caused the extinction of this species. And you know that amphibians are very sensitive to humidity conditions, and they cannot survive under extreme low humidity. And this particular toad was adapted to cloud forests where humidity is almost 100%. But as a result of changes of the climate, mainly because of the warming oceans, the humidity actually changed and the species went extinct. And amphibians are one of the most vulnerable groups to extinction because of climate change, because they are very sensitive. They have wet skins and they breathe through their skins. And recently they have assessed the status of thousands of amphibians and found that 122 of amphibians are possibly extinct. And one of the leading causes is some diseases, some emerging diseases, such as chytrid fungus. So they have done some extensive studies with harlequin frogs, and we have about 110 known species, and they are endemic to American tropics, and we may actually see some of these guys in Ecuador. And the warming climate actually triggered an expansion of a fungal disease, chytridiomycosis, and they have observed that 80% of Atelopus species, so harlequin frogs, disappeared after a single hot year. And most of the extinctions were actually coming from mid elevations. About 90% of species went extinct, and mid elevations have the most appropriate temperature for the optimal growth of this particular fungus. So with that, I'm going to jump into our last topic under threats: invasive species. So what are invasive species? So some people call them alien species, some call them non-native, some call them exotic. Okay, so let's try to clarify the terminology first. Some species occur outside of their natural range, and we call them either exotic or non-native species, and in some cases we call them alien species. However, some of those will established and they actually start making some issues. So some of them actually threaten the native species or native ecosystems. In some other cases, they cause economic or social impacts. Once they reach that level, the noxious level, we call them invasive species. In these pictures, you can see common carp is something native to Asia, and the Fish and Game Department actually introduced them into Hudson River in mid 1800s to increase the access to proteins. But nowadays nobody eats common carp, and they are everywhere. They are making a huge mess. And the second one, this one is cane toad, and they actually introduce cane toads to sugarcane plantations to control sugarcane pests, but they are eating everything and they are spreading rapidly. And in the last picture, this is actually not a field, this is a lake, but the entire lake is covered with a water hyacinth. It's an invasive plant and grows rapidly asexually, and it can completely alter the hydrological cycles. You may remember this paper, right? Wilco et al. And they have identified introduced species as the second greatest cause to imperil species in United States. And this graph actually shows the rate of the introduction of mollusks and fish. And this graph shows the rate of introduction of invasive plants and insects. So the take-home point is we are introducing more and more species very rapidly, and some of these will establish as serious invasive species such as kudzu and emerald ash borer. So there are several ways of introduction. Sometimes we introduce things intentionally, like we introduce ringneck pheasants to Great Plains to support hunting, and now the state bird of South Dakota is ringneck pheasant, and they are everywhere. And sometimes we actually introduce things just to be familiar, and early settlers actually introduced house sparrows from Europe because they've been reading stories of Shakespeare, and he usually talks about house sparrows and starlings. So some people thought, why not just release some starlings and house sparrows in US, this new world? And they did a wonderful job, and they are everywhere now. And sometimes we introduce things through horticulture and agriculture, such as kudzu. Sometimes we actually introduce things accidentally, maybe through ship ballast. Zebra mussels were introduced to US through ship ballast, and it's making a lot of issues right now in Great Lakes. And brown tree snake was introduced to Guam in 1950s, and we think that it came with some cargo, some air cargo. And northern snakehead is a popular topic in Virginia, and people think that it was originated to some accidental introductions through aquarium trade. And also sometimes people introduce crayfish and other minnows as bait bucket introductions. In other cases, people are spreading things as a biological control agent. One good example is mosquito fish, and it has the widest distribution of any given vertebrate other than humans in the world, and it causing serious issues to native aquatic species and some aquatic ecosystems. And sometimes we introduce things to support sport fishing and food fish like common carp and brown trout. But the thing is, once they have high population densities, they can actually create some issues to native species and native ecosystems. So what are these impacts? Some native species can actually decline in their population size, and in some other cases they can completely wipe out some native populations. And also in some other cases they can alter ecological conditions and completely convert native habitats into novel ecosystems. Some other cases they introduce diseases and parasites, and in some rare cases they actually interbreed with closely related native species and eventually replace the native through hybridization. More importantly, they can create an economic damage more than $100 billion per year. And I'm not going to details. I'm going to let you explore about the impacts of invasive species, but I would finish the lecture with this. This is the impact of brown tree snake in Guam. Guam is an island nation. It's a territory of US, and it's a really nice place for birds. A lot of species, but in 1950s, accidentally a few brown tree snakes got into this island, and this is what happened after the introduction. And you can see in many cases there's a sudden decline of the populations, but in some other cases there's extirpations. Guam rail is completely gone, and brown noddy is completely gone. White-throated ground dove is completely gone. These are extinctions, or we can call them extirpations, because these are local extinctions, and many species declined and some other species completely extirpated. So with that, I'm going to stop this. Thank you very much.